At a family dinner meant to feel familiar, my wife calmly decided my place for me. She explained, without anger, that I wouldn't be joining them for Christmas. She said everyone was tired of my old age, tired of the weight I carried into rooms just by existing. I watched my children accept it with careful silence, and I understood something painful in that moment. This wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. I stayed home alone while they left together, the house settling into a quiet that felt permanent. I told myself this was what being tolerated eventually becomes. Then, at 12:39 a.m., my phone erupted. Alerts, messages, missed calls stacked faster than I could read them. My son's name kept appearing, frantic and disoriented, saying I was suddenly everywhere. On CBC News, tied to a story so large it shattered the version of me they had agreed to forget. Before we go any further, I want to ask something honestly. If you've ever felt quietly pushed aside by the people you gave your life to, please consider subscribing and sharing your story in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone is the only thing that keeps us standing. The dinner took place at my daughter's house outside Dayton, Ohio, the kind of suburban development where every lawn is trimmed to the same height and every porch light glows with identical warmth. I arrived early, as I always did, carrying a bottle of wine I'd spent too long choosing. I remember standing on the front step for a moment before knocking, straightening my jacket, practicing the small smile I'd learned to wear in recent years, the one that said I was present but not imposing. Inside, the house was already full. A long dining table stretched through the room, dressed in matching plates, folded napkins, and centerpieces that looked curated rather than chosen. It was the kind of setup meant to signal unity and care, but I felt immediately that it was staged. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was spontaneous. Even the laughter seemed timed. Everyone spoke carefully that evening. Conversations skimmed along the surface. Weather, work updates, a neighbor's renovation. Topics that required no depth and no risk. I noticed how often voices lowered when I entered a room, then rose again when I stepped away. I had learned not to comment on that sort of thing. Pointing it out only made people uncomfortable, and I had already been accused of making rooms feel heavy. When we finally sat down, my wife, Karen, cleared her throat softly. She didn't look at me at first. Her hands rested neatly beside her plate, fingers interlaced, posture calm. There was no anger in her face, no frustration. That was the part that unsettled me most. What she was about to say had already been decided, processed, and accepted by everyone but me. She explained, in a voice steady enough to sound kind, that Christmas this year would be simpler if I stayed home. She said I'd become difficult without realizing it, that my opinions lingered too long in conversations. She said my presence changed the mood, made people feel like they had to be careful. She framed it as concern, as consideration for everyone's comfort, including mine. I watched my son, Mark, as she spoke. He kept his eyes on his plate, nodding slightly at intervals, as if following a script he'd already rehearsed. My daughter, Lily, looked up occasionally, offering small affirmations, nothing explicit, just enough to signal agreement. She smiled at me once, briefly, the way someone does when they hope you'll understand without forcing them to explain further. No one interrupted. No one questioned the premise. There were no raised voices, no dramatic pauses. It struck me then that this conversation hadn't begun at that table. I was simply hearing the final version. I realized, slowly and painfully, that they weren't asking me to stay home for Christmas. They were informing me that I already had. Somewhere along the line, a quiet consensus had formed without my knowledge, and tonight was merely the formality of delivering the outcome. I tried to respond with reason. I said I didn't realize I'd been such a burden. I said I was willing to listen, to adjust. My words landed softly and disappeared. Karen nodded, thanked me for understanding, and suggested we all focus on enjoying the rest of the evening. And just like that, the conversation moved on. Plates were passed, glasses refilled, laughter returned, lighter now, as if something uncomfortable had finally been addressed and set aside. I sat there, still, aware that the space I occupied had already been mentally cleared. When dinner ended, coats were gathered and plans discussed. Who would drive with whom, what time they'd leave for Christmas morning. No one asked about my plans. There was an assumption, unspoken but complete, that I would manage on my own. I hugged my children goodbye, feeling the distance in their arms, the careful restraint. Karen kissed my cheek and told me she'd call when they arrived. I watched them leave through the front window, their silhouettes merging into the night. The house felt smaller after that, quieter in a way that pressed against my ears. I sat for a while in the living room, not turning on any lights, replaying the evening in my mind. Not to argue with it, but to understand how I'd missed the moment when I stopped being included. By the time I drove home, the decision felt final. The road was empty, the radio low. I told myself this was what happens when time moves faster for others than it does for you. You become a reminder of something they're trying to outgrow. I unlocked the front door to a dark house and stood there longer than necessary, keys still in my hand. I didn't feel angry. I felt catalogued, assessed, set aside. And as I turned off the last light and prepared for bed, I had no idea that this quiet exclusion, so carefully delivered, was about to collide with a truth none of them were ready to face. The morning after the dinner, the house moved on without me. I woke early out of habit, the same way I had for decades, and lay still for a moment listening to the quiet. Karen's side of the bed was already empty. The sheets were smooth, tucked in with the same care she used for everything else now. Efficient, distant, complete. There was no note on the nightstand, no trace of the conversation we'd had the night before. It struck me how quickly something life-altering could be treated like a minor scheduling adjustment. In the kitchen, I found a short note on the counter. It mentioned groceries, milk, bread, something about the recycling schedule. Nothing else. No acknowledgement of Christmas, no mention of the decision that had been delivered with such finality. I realized then that this was part of the pattern. Difficult things were never discussed twice. Once the decision was made, it was absorbed into routine, as if repetition might invite reconsideration. Karen had already left for a volunteer meeting. She'd taken on more of those in recent years. I think it gave her a sense of structure that she no longer felt at home. I poured myself coffee and stood by the sink, watching steam rise from the mug, grounding myself in the familiar. I wasn't angry. Anger would have implied surprise. What I felt instead was a growing clarity, the kind that arrives when you stop expecting fairness and start observing reality as it is. I spent the rest of the morning in the garage. That space had become mine in a way the rest of the house no longer was. The shelves were cluttered, the workbench worn smooth from use, the air carrying the faint smell of metal and oil. For months, I'd been working on something there, quietly, methodically, without announcing it. Not because it was a secret, but because no one had asked what I was doing in a very long time. There was a time when my work interested people, when questions came naturally, when my experience was seen as something to lean on rather than something to work around. Over the years, those questions had stopped. Conversations shifted. My answers began to feel like interruptions. Eventually, I learned to keep my focus to myself. What I'd been building wasn't just a project in the physical sense. It was preparation. Meetings had been scheduled, calls returned, documents reviewed. All of it handled during hours when the house was quiet, when I could think clearly. People on the other end of those conversations still treated my experience like it mattered. They listened carefully. They asked follow-up questions. They didn't rush me. That contrast stayed with me. While my family moved through the day under the assumption that my role had diminished, processes were unfolding elsewhere. Formal, deliberate, and precise. Paperwork was moving forward. Agreements were being refined. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Just steady progress built on years of accumulated work and decisions made long before this moment. I remember pausing at one point, resting my hands on the workbench, and realizing how little any of this depended on their approval. That was a difficult thought to sit with, not because it was painful, but because it exposed how much of my identity I'd tied to being needed at home. I'd mistaken familiarity for value. The afternoon passed quietly. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I worked, cleaned up, and put tools back where they belonged. Order has always helped me think. By the time Karen returned in the early evening, The garage looked exactly as it always did. Nothing to signal that anything important had happened there at all. She asked how my day had been. I said it was fine. She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and moved on to talking about travel plans, about weather forecasts and traffic. I listened without interrupting. There was a part of me that recognized this as another rehearsal, another version of events being shaped without my input. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the word difficult, how often it's used when someone stops being convenient, how easily it replaces words like experienced, careful, or unwilling to pretend. I didn't feel old in that moment. I felt unseen. But beneath that, there was something steadier taking hold. A sense that while my place at the table had been quietly reassigned, my footing in the world had not. The structures I'd built over a lifetime, professional, legal, financial, were still standing. They didn't depend on who invited me where, or how often my opinions were welcomed over dinner. As I turned off the light, I understood that what was happening wasn't just exclusion. It was a procedural betrayal, the slow, administrative kind, delivered through routines and assumptions rather than confrontation. And like most things handled that way, it left a trail of documentation behind it. I had always been good at reading those trails. And soon, whether they intended it or not, my family was going to realize that the story they'd settled on didn't align with the facts that were quietly coming into place. Karen packed for Christmas as if there were still a version of events in which I might change my mind. She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, folding clothes, setting aside gifts, lining shoes by the door. She packed coats for everyone, including mine. My old scarf, the one I'd worn for years, frayed at the edges, was placed neatly on top of the suitcase. It wasn't an oversight. It was a gesture, a quiet one, loaded with implication. If I decided to fall back into line, everything was ready. We didn't talk about it. That silence became its own language. It said, "We've already discussed this enough." It said, any further explanation would only complicate things. I watched her from the doorway once, her back turned, carefully arranging items that would be carried into a family celebration I was no longer part of. There was no cruelty in her movements, just finality. The morning they left, the house felt oddly formal, like a place being closed for the season. Karen checked lists, made sure doors were locked, reminded me of emergency numbers I already knew by heart. She kissed my cheek and told me not to wait up. I nodded, holding the door open as they walked out, luggage rolling behind them. No one looked back. I stayed standing there for a moment after the car pulled away, listening to the engine fade. Then I closed the door and locked it, the sound echoing through the entryway. On Christmas Eve, Mark called. It was brief, too brief. His voice had that distant politeness people use when they're completing an obligation. He asked how I was doing, told me the drive had been fine, mentioned traffic and weather. Then, almost as an aside, he said Mom told him I'd decided to stay home this year, that it was my choice. I didn't correct him. There are moments when you realize that the version of events being shared about you has already solidified. Pushing against it only makes you seem defensive or worse, unstable. So I let that version settle. I listened as he spoke, offered neutral responses, and wished him a good night. When the call ended, something inside me shifted, not sharply, but decisively. My absence had been rewritten in real time. What had been presented as a family decision was now being framed as my preference. That was the personal violation, not the exclusion itself, but the erasure of how it happened. I spent Christmas Eve alone, moving through the house without turning on many lights. I made myself a simple dinner and ate at the kitchen counter. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Most families already gathered somewhere else. I didn't feel lonely in the way people often imagine. I felt edited. Later that night, I sat in the living room with a notebook, reviewing documents I'd already gone through several times. Dates, signatures, timelines. The work grounded me. It reminded me that while narratives can be reshaped casually in conversation, records are less forgiving. They hold. I thought about how easily roles change when people stop seeing your interior life. How quickly decades of contribution can be summarized as difficult. I wondered when my children had started speaking about me instead of to me. Not with malice, but with that subtle condescension reserved for someone whose relevance is assumed to be fading. Around midnight I went to bed. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept circling the same realization. This wasn't about one holiday. It was about control of the story, about who gets to define why someone is absent and what that absence means. Once you allow others to explain you away, they rarely stop at one occasion. At exactly 12:39 a.m., my phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some stray alert or group message sent too late. Then it vibrated again and again. The screen lit up repeatedly, casting sharp light across the room. Missed calls stacked one after another. Notifications I didn't recognize. A news alert. Then another. I reached for the phone. My heart steady but my attention fully engaged now. The quiet I'd been sitting in all evening shattered. Not loudly, but completely. And in that sudden rupture, I understood that the version of me my family had agreed upon was about to collide with something far larger than any dinner table decision. Whatever story they had settled on was no longer contained within the family. And once that happens, it's impossible to pretend nothing has changed. At exactly 12:39 a.m., the phone stopped being an object and became an event. It vibrated so insistently that it felt alive in my hand, as if urgency itself had weight. Alerts stacked faster than I could clear them. Names, headlines, unfamiliar app icons. I sat up in bed, suddenly fully awake, scrolling through fragments that didn't yet form a coherent picture. My name appeared more than once. That alone was enough to slow my breathing. Then Mark's call came through. I answered without speaking. His voice was unsteady, stripped of the politeness he'd used earlier that evening. He wasn't careful now. He wasn't managing tone or choosing words. He sounded panicked, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he didn't know where to stand. He asked if there had been some kind of mistake. He said my name was on the CBC News app. He said there were numbers involved, figures he repeated twice, as if saying them again might make them less real. He asked me to tell him this was wrong, that there was some confusion, some coincidence of names. I listened until he finished. When I spoke, my voice surprised even me. It was calm, not rehearsed, not guarded, just factual. I told him there was no mistake. I told him the story had been in motion for months. I didn't offer details. I didn't need to. The shock in his silence said enough. While we were still on the call, another alert came in. Then another. News outlets began picking it up. The framing shifted quickly, from initial speculation to confirmation, from rumor to analysis. My phone buzzed with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former colleagues, industry contacts, a lawyer I trusted confirming what was now public and what would be next. Mark kept asking how this was possible, how he hadn't known, why no one had said anything. I didn't answer those questions directly, not because I wanted to avoid them, but because the answers weren't simple, and this wasn't the moment for reflection. This was the moment when the story my family had settled into, the quiet one, the convenient one, began to fracture under the weight of facts. By the time we ended the call, the house no longer felt silent, felt charged, as if something long dormant had finally been acknowledged. I stood in the living room, phone in hand, watching the clock tick forward, aware that somewhere miles away, my family was scrambling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed. What struck me most wasn't the scale of the news. It was the speed with which interest returned. People who hadn't asked what I was working on suddenly wanted context. Commentary panels speculated about my role, my history, my unexpected reemergence. That word appeared more than once. Reemergence. As if I had vanished by choice, as if I hadn't been present all along, just unobserved. Around 1:15 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Lily. Her voice was quieter than Mark's had been, but no less unsettled. She said she'd seen the headline. She asked if I was okay. The question landed differently now, layered with realization. I told her I was fine. I told her I had been fine all evening. There was a pause after that. A long one. In that silence, I sensed the first real crack. Not in the news cycle, but in the narrative my family had constructed. The idea that I'd been diminishing, fading, becoming difficult because I had nothing left to contribute. That idea could not coexist with what was now unfolding publicly. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt exposed. There's a difference between choosing privacy and being forced into visibility. I'd been content working quietly, letting outcomes speak when they were ready. Now the timing had been taken out of my hands. The story was no longer mine to release gradually. It was being broadcast, interpreted, and assigned meaning by strangers. And yet, beneath that discomfort, there was a steadiness I recognized. The same steadiness I'd felt in the garage, in meetings where my experience was treated with respect, in documents that bore my name without apology. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a reveal. By 2 a.m., messages from Karen began to come through. Short at first, then longer. Questions layered with concern, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or fear of what this meant for the assumptions she'd been operating under. I didn't respond right away, not out of spite, but because I understood something important in that moment. Once the silence around you becomes unstable, you don't rush to fill it. You let it do its work. You allow people to sit with the discomfort of realizing they might have misjudged the space you occupied. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd eaten dinner alone just hours earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on me. The house hadn't changed. I hadn't changed. But the way others were forced to see me had. And for the first time since that dinner outside Dayton, I understood that the exclusion I'd accepted quietly was never about my age or my presence. It was about their certainty that I no longer mattered in ways that could surprise them. That certainty was gone now. And once it's gone, it doesn't come back easily. By morning, the story had settled into its public shape. The early alerts gave way to longer analyses, context pieces, profiles that reached back through decades of work I'd never thought of as material for headlines. Reporters described the deal as years in the making, which was accurate in the most literal sense. What they couldn't capture was the quiet discipline behind it, the patience required to build something substantial without applause, to let progress accumulate unnoticed. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching daylight move across the floor. The house was still empty. Karen wouldn't be back until later that afternoon. I had time to think without interruption, and I needed it. The truth was simple. The deal hadn't happened overnight. It had been forming slowly, deliberately, in conversations that never made it into dinner talk. I hadn't hidden it out of spite. I hadn't withheld information to prove a point. I'd simply stopped offering parts of myself to rooms that no longer seemed interested. Every earlier attempt to talk about my work had been met the same way. Smiles that didn't invite elaboration, jokes that redirected the subject, polite nods that signaled closure. Over time, I learned to recognize that response as disinterest wrapped in courtesy. So I adjusted. I spoke where I was heard. I worked where my judgment carried weight. Control doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It accumulates. When Karen came home early from the trip, she didn't take off her coat right away. She stood in the doorway, phone still in her hand, as if she hadn't fully stepped back into the house. Her expression was careful, composed, but unsettled. She asked why I hadn't told her. The question hung there, heavy with implication. I told her the truth. I said interest only arrived once my value had been confirmed by strangers. I said it wasn't secrecy that had kept her uninformed, but absence of curiosity. That distinction mattered to me. It wasn't an accusation. It was an explanation. She sat down slowly, as if absorbing a shift she hadn't prepared for. She asked how long it had been in progress. When I told her, she looked away, not in disbelief but recognition. She knew, then, that this wasn't a sudden reinvention. It was continuity she hadn't been tracking. By then, the control was already mine. That afternoon, I received calls from advisors and partners, each one focused, efficient, respectful. We discussed next steps, not optics. Strategy, not apologies. The work moved forward the way it always had, through preparation and clear-eyed assessment, not reaction. Karen watched some of those calls from a distance. I could feel her recalibrating, trying to reconcile the man she'd quietly categorized as fading with the one now fielding decisions that would ripple outward for years. It wasn't anger on her face. It was disorientation. Later, Mark called again. His tone had changed. Less panic now, more searching. He wanted to know why I hadn't leaned on them, why I'd carried something so significant alone. I told him I had leaned, just not where balance was no longer offered. I said there's a difference between being supported and being tolerated. He was quiet for a long time after that. What I didn't say, what I didn't need to say, was that this moment wasn't a turning point for me. It was a revelation for them. I had been moving with intention all along, making decisions that aligned with who I was rather than who I was being reduced to. The visibility was new. The footing was not. That evening, as messages continued to arrive, I turned my phone face down and stepped into the garage. The familiar smell grounded me. I looked at the project I'd been refining for months, hands resting on the workbench, and felt a steady satisfaction. Not pride, exactly, but alignment. For years, I'd allowed others to decide when I was relevant, when my presence was welcome, when my voice was too much. I'd mistaken accommodation for harmony. Now, without raising my voice or demanding recognition, I had shifted the terms simply by continuing to build where it mattered. The strategic shift wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about refusing to be defined by disinterest, about understanding that dignity isn't reclaimed through confrontation, but through consistency. When I went back inside, Karen was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at her phone. She asked what would happen next. I told her the same thing I told everyone else. The work would continue. Carefully, lawfully, on my terms. She nodded, slowly, not agreeing yet, just acknowledging that the ground had moved. And for the first time since that dinner outside Dayton, I felt no need to explain myself further. The truth was already doing its work, quietly, relentlessly, reshaping what could no longer be denied. Mark and Lily came over together that evening. They didn't announce it ahead of time. There was no request. No attempt to negotiate a moment that might be more convenient. They arrived quietly, parked close to the curb, and stood at the door longer than usual before knocking. I noticed that from the living room window, the hesitation, the subtle recalibration before crossing a threshold that suddenly felt unfamiliar. When I opened the door, neither of them smiled right away. We sat at the kitchen table. No one reached for coffee. No one checked their phone. Karen stayed in the living room, not as an act of avoidance, but recognition. This was not a conversation she could mediate. Whatever needed to be addressed belonged to the three of us. There was no shouting, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. That was important to me. Mark spoke first. He said they hadn't realized how long it had been since they truly listened. He didn't frame it as cruelty or intention. He said it had happened gradually, through assumptions made easier by routine. Lily added that they'd confused my quiet endurance with irrelevance, that they'd mistaken my willingness to step back as evidence that I had nothing left to offer. I let them speak without interruption. I watched how carefully they chose their words now, how deliberate their posture had become. This was not guilt. Guilt would have rushed them toward absolution. This was something closer to humility, arriving late but intact. When they finished, I didn't respond right away. Silence has a way of recalibrating power in a room. Not by dominating it, but by refusing to fill it prematurely. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd said without being immediately reassured. Finally, I told them I didn't feel angry. That surprised them. I explained that anger would have meant I still expected something different from them in that moment. What I felt instead was clarity. I told them I'd accepted the Christmas decision not because it was fair, but because it revealed something I needed to see. It showed me how easily my place in their lives had become conditional, dependent on how comfortable I made things for them. I told them respect couldn't be transactional, couldn't arrive only after headlines or numbers or public recognition. It couldn't depend on whether my work impressed strangers enough to force a reassessment. If anything was rebuilt between us, it would have to be slow, deliberate, and real. or it wouldn't be rebuilt at all. Neither of them argued. Mark nodded, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Lily's eyes stayed on the table, but her breathing slowed, as if she were letting go of the urge to defend something that no longer held up under scrutiny. I could see them both recalculating, not how to fix this quickly, but how to live with the consequences of having misjudged someone they thought they understood. I told them I wasn't interested in apologies delivered out of embarrassment. I wasn't interested in being reinserted into plans or traditions simply to restore balance or appearances. I said that if they wanted me present in their lives going forward, it would have to be because they valued who I was, not because they feared how my absence might look. That was the line that shifted everything. Mark looked up then. Not with panic, not with pleading. With recognition. Lily followed a moment later. They understood that the reversal they were hoping for wasn't something I could grant on the spot. It wasn't a favor. It was a process that would require consistency and restraint, the same qualities I'd been practicing quietly for years. We didn't discuss Christmas again. There was no need. When they stood to leave, the atmosphere was subdued but not hostile. There was no attempt at forced closeness, no hugs meant to signal resolution. Just a shared understanding that something had ended, and something else, if it were to exist at all, would have to begin differently. After they left, Karen joined me at the table. She didn't ask what was said. She didn't need a summary. She simply placed her hand near mine. Not on it, not possessive, just present. I let it stay there. It was enough. That night, as the house settled again into quiet, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Not triumph, not vindication, but alignment. The reversal hadn't come with celebration or apology tours. It had come with acknowledgement, and with it, a return of agency that didn't require me to raise my voice or sharpen my edges. Nothing more needed to be said, because for the first time in a long while, the terms were no longer being set around me. A year passed without ceremony. No announcements. No declarations that things were better now. Just time doing what it always does when people stop forcing outcomes and start paying attention to behavior. The days filled themselves naturally again, not with noise, but with purpose. I returned fully to my work, not as an escape, but as an extension of who I'd always been. Mornings had shape, evenings had weight. I slept better than I had in years. Mark and Lily didn't disappear, but they didn't rush back either. That mattered. When they called, it wasn't to update me on plans or to seek reassurance. They asked questions. Not performative ones, not polite placeholders, but real ones. About how I was spending my time. About what I was thinking. About what I wanted, not what I would tolerate. Karen changed too, though more quietly. She stopped narrating my days for me. Stopped assuming where I would or wouldn't fit. There were moments, small, unspoken ones, when I could tell she was reevaluating not just me, but the ease with which she'd accepted a version of our life that required my gradual erasure. We didn't rehash the past. We didn't need to. Accountability doesn't always arrive as confession. Sometimes it arrives as changed behavior sustained over time. Work filled my days again, but not in the way it once had. I no longer chased relevance. I didn't feel the need to justify my pace or explain my choices. I chose projects carefully. I said no without apology. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing you're no longer auditioning for your own life. I had forgotten that feeling once. I didn't intend to forget it again. When Christmas came around the following year, there was no discussion about who would be where. We were all together, not out of obligation, not because tradition demanded it, but because awareness had replaced assumption. The house was fuller, louder, but not in the way it had been before. Conversations moved differently now. There was space, not just for speaking, but for listening. No one commented on the change directly. They didn't need to. I could see it in how Mark waited before responding, how Lily no longer rushed to smooth discomfort. Even Karen, in her own way, allowed silences to stand without filling them. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I returned to the garage. The lights were low. The tools were exactly where I'd left them. I stood there for a long moment before picking anything up, letting the stillness settle. Then I began working on a new idea, Not because I needed to prove anything, not because someone was watching, but because the act itself still mattered to me. That was the realization I'd almost lost. I wasn't obsolete. I had never been. I had simply been waiting, patiently, quietly, for the world around me to either catch up or move aside. And when it finally did one or the other, I was still standing, still capable, still whole. That knowledge didn't make me louder.